What's up, guys? First of all, congratulations to Saab, who's one of the only people who watches this channel and probably the most frequent commenter. A 3-0 in those college basketball plays that you gave out in the comments yesterday. That is solid. Wisconsin does look like they've completely gone off the rails. I don't know what is happening with them. We'll see what happens with them. I still think that they're going to be kind of a dangerous team to face in the Big Ten tournament, but we'll see what happens with that, because right now they are just looking awful. They can't beat teams that are way beneath them. It's kind of crazy. And then Bonaventure and BYU both got there. BYU, that game was fun to watch because I don't like Kansas at all, and I hate Hunter Dickinson. I think he's one of the dirtiest players that I've ever seen, and seeing him just bomb at the free throw line like that was amazing. Like, I think he was like 6 for 14 from the free throw line or something like that, and just bricked a couple more at the end of the game when they still had a little bit of shred of hope, and it was just completely eliminated. BYU had to make a huge comeback in that game, and they did just that on the road. Huge win for BYU. Awesome. I didn't expect BYU to win outright, although I did like them to cover that number. That was awesome. I had a terrible day, 2-4, and I think it should have gone differently. Really, the only legitimate loss that I had, I would say, was the NHL one. I went 1-1 with those NHL underdogs, which is fine enough. I mean, that's a win overall, going 1-1 on those moneyline underdogs. The Vegas Knights, easy wins. That was looking like a good night early on for a bit, and then whatever the other one was, I lost badly. The Ottawa Senators on a back-to-back, whatever. They didn't play well in that game. They got outplayed. That was the worst loss. That's an acceptable loss. Even the first basketball game of the day was the most acceptable of those losses. I would say, I guess, with Mississippi State, and I still think they probably were the right side and should have gotten there. I mean, the first half played like you would expect. It was not a particularly high-scoring game. They were keeping Kentucky in check, and they were up 8 at the half. That was looking pretty good, and they still had a decent lead pretty deep into the game, into the second half. The lead kind of went away, but it still looked like, all right, Mississippi State, they can just hang on to like a lead of like a few points. They can get this done. But then they fell behind, and that was just kind of that, and they wound up actually losing the game. That was just bad, but it still looked like it was going to be a good night, even despite that. It looked like I was going to go 4-2. Everything else was looking pretty good. I mean, Notre Dame was the first one of the other games that finished, I think, and that one got there. So that was looking pretty good at that point. And then the rest of it was just a complete disaster. So at that point, I think, what was I, 2-2, and it was looking like I was going to go 4-2. And then the Wyoming game, that absolutely should have gotten there, even though Wyoming was losing by about 8 or 9 in the second half. That game was insanely low scoring. The first half was like 23-19 UNLV or something, so insanely low scoring, even though I had plus 5.5 on Wyoming, which I think was the best you could. I think the number was just 5.5 all day, basically. And they were down 4 at the half, which isn't good. But when you're looking at it's 23-19, you're like, man, points are really hard to come by here. It's a good thing I'm on the underdog here. Even though UNLV did push the lead to like 8 or 9 or something in the middle of the second half, Wyoming refused to go away. They got a couple of breaks near the end. Maybe they got too many breaks, because at the end of that game, I was almost hoping, like, I hope this doesn't go into overtime, and I hope they miss one of these free throws or something to lose by 1, because they were going to cover. I mean, they were within the number for the final entire last 2 minutes or whatever. They kept scoring to a counter UNLV scoring to stay in that game. They were down like 1, 2, 3, 4 points for that entire span. Wound up tying the game on 2 free throws with like 5 seconds left. UNLV actually then turned it over for a second straight time, actually stepped out of bounds after they had lost the ball in the prior possession. They stepped out of bounds just totally inexplicably, giving Wyoming the ball now in a tied game with 5 seconds left, and Wyoming didn't get the best shot off. They took a 2, which is at least a higher percentage shot, I guess, but the way that the shot, it was still like a well-defended jumper. Like, it was not going to hit. Then it goes into overtime, and I'm like, this is probably not good. And, of course, what winds up happening is UNLV winds up winning by 6 and covering by a half point. That was a game that never should have been a loss on the Wyoming side. They're plus the 5.5. That should have been the winning side. That basically was the winning side. That's one of those ones that just like really, really destroys you. And then the NBA game had to make my night even worse with the Portland Trailblazers. They're winning by what? Like almost 20 points in the first half or something. They were completely massacring the Heat. The Heat had Jimmy Butler back and Jovic back, which I think kind of disrupted their lineup. Maybe I should have made it a first half play or something because they seemed to get some more chemistry as the game went on. But those two guys came back. Rozier was also back, but I don't think he played that many minutes. And Hero was actually still out, so he's not back from injury. But even so, those other guys all came back. It like disrupted what they were trying to do. They were bad in the first half, and Portland was looking like this was going to be an easy cover, man. I mean, they were up. I don't know if they were up quite by 20, but it was like at least it had to be like 15. So they were covering by more than 20 points throughout the first half, winning by double digits as a 7-point underdog. I think I wound up getting 7 on that game. I'd mentioned that you could just kind of wait on that number and you probably be able to still get the 6.5 at worst, because if anything, it was only going to just tick up a little bit with Miami releasing like what their starting lineup was going to be and knowing that some of these guys might come back, although it wound up just being Rozier because we knew that Butler and Jovic were coming back off of the suspension. So that was definitive. But even so, yeah, Portland was still winning that entire game. Then they had a really awful third quarter, and I was like, is this really happening? Is this really going to happen? But I think they still stuck within the number. I think they still did not let it actually get to a 7-point lead. I think it only got up to 6, and Portland came back again and either tied it or retook the lead again. And they were still, the game was tied or like a 1-point lead for Portland or something with like, I think 8 minutes left to go in the fourth quarter or something. So it looked like, all right, they're still going to wind up getting it done and covering. And then no, they just completely fall apart and wind up losing by 10. And that's the type of game where even if they're down like a couple points, like in the fourth quarter, it goes down to like intentional free throws. It's like, yeah, you're going to lose by 7 and it'll be a push. And that's bad enough, but maybe I'd have been able to accept a push a little bit more. Even that would have kind of been unacceptable. But a loss in that game when Portland was just absolutely blowing the doors off of Miami, and Miami just looked like total ass in that game. And I think I got the handicap right. If you look at the statistics, it was all field goal percentage. That was the difference, like kind of the unpredictable field goal percentage. I think Miami shot almost 50% from 3 or something like that, and like 54% from the floor. That just doesn't happen that often, especially in a game where they were losing the whole game. Portland had more field goal attempts by double digits. They had more rebounds by, I think, at least 8. They had fewer turnovers. So Portland had like all the statistical advantage. Like statistically, it looked like it should have been a win for Portland, and they didn't even cover at home as a 7-point underdog, despite also winning by like 20 points in the first half. And winning at various points in the second half. It's just, and they were winning by double digits at the half as well. It's just, that one is really difficult to take. It just came down to a ridiculous field goal discrepancy. Even in the more predictable field goal percentage, it was off, but the unpredictable field goal percentage, which is more like 3-point percentage and stuff, Miami, I think, had at least 4 more 3-pointers. They shot like 50% from beyond the arc, and Portland was only like 30% or something. That's difficult to take. That whole night was like really difficult to take, especially when I've been hot, and it seemed like my handicapping was like really good last night, except for the one NHL loss. Like every other handicap, I think, was right on. We moved to today, and it's a smaller card, even though it's a giant college basketball card because it is Wednesday. I'm being really selective, and I actually don't like much of the college basketball card at all, and I'm just kind of avoiding most of it. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll just mention NHL. I'm not playing either of these games. They're only 2 games, and they're both games involving pretty big favorites. The Rangers are playing Columbus and actually just lost to Columbus. So I'd probably expect the Rangers to actually kind of show up just because they know they just lost to that team and they're the better team. So I don't want to get involved in that one. And then I don't even know what the other game is. Edmonton, St. Louis. I think St. Louis played last night and Edmonton did not. And St. Louis played Winnipeg, although they lost. So that's still a tough opponent. So St. Louis in a back-to-back against Edmonton. Yeah, I don't want to touch either of those games. So I will not be doing so. College basketball, I'm close to almost wanting to jump in on Texas A&M, but I think that the number is just way off because this is another way off. It's far off enough that I don't want to play it. Like this is another one of those home unranked favorites against a ranked road opponent, and the ranked road opponent is South Carolina. And I keep talking about how overrated South Carolina is. They're still in the rankings at 18, and their record is really good, but Ken Pom has them like in the 40s or something ranking wise. Not a very good team. kind of a mediocre team, and they do play a really like slow tempo. But KenPom also has them at 5th in luck in the entire nation. They play a slow tempo, so that kind of lends itself to having a lot of closer games, and they just happen to fall on the right side of a lot of these closer games. The problem that I have with this is that both KenPom and Bart Torvik both actually have South Carolina still rated actually above Texas A&M. So Texas A&M, they've gone up from a 3-point favorite. I don't even know when it was 3. Maybe like very briefly it was 3 early on. They've gone all the way up to 5. I think you'd still get 4.5s out there if you really want to lay it with Texas A&M, but Bart Torvik and Texas A&M and KenPom both have Texas A&M as the somewhat worse team, like ranked. I think they both have them ranked like in the 50s, and they both have South Carolina in like the 40s. So they both have this game being like a 2-point win for Texas A&M. So laying the 4.5 is really bucking the power ratings, maybe a little bit too much for my liking. And I think at this point the books are like having to adjust for these home favorites. I mean, we saw another one of them go down last night with Mississippi State, even though I don't think it should have, and I don't think the line was that far off on the Mississippi State one. I think it was only off by like maybe 1.5 points, and given the situation, I thought it was good enough to play Mississippi State, and I still think it should have gotten there, but the books are looking like they know that this is a phenomenon this year, that the unranked home favorite versus the ranked road opponent has been cashing at an absurd rate this year, and I think they're skewing the line a bit more than they were a little while ago, even like a week ago. I think they're skewing the line more than they were then, so it's a little bit dicey to jump in on Texas A&M here, although I still would lean to the Texas A&M side. I mean, I don't think South Carolina is obviously still the much more overrated team. They're coming off a pretty big win, I guess, on the road over Ole Miss. I mean, that's kind of proving something, even though Ole Miss is one of the other most overrated teams. Like I mentioned, those two teams have been two of like the most overrated teams in college basketball, really, South Carolina and Ole Miss. Ole Miss has sort of trailed off a bit more, though, but Ole Miss was still favored in that game. And South Carolina was able to complete the season sweep of them in that game. So it was a revenge spot for Ole Miss, and South Carolina still went into their house and easily won and beat them by double digits. So coming off a pretty decent win is South Carolina, and then they have Florida and Tennessee up next, which are their two final home games of the regular season. So those games are bigger than this game against Texas A&M as well, who they haven't faced this year, and this is a second straight road game. Arguably a little bit of a sandwich spot, coming off the pretty good win over Ole Miss, and then having Florida and Tennessee up next. And Texas A&M, I think they're going to be focused, man, because they're still, I think, considered to be like one of the like last teams getting into the tournament right now, just because they face like a pretty difficult schedule, and they have like that win over Tennessee and a win over Kentucky. So those are like pretty big, and they've played some other like pretty close games against some of the best teams. Played Houston close. Texas A&M, they're on a 4-game losing streak, though, so I think they're going to be the more motivated team here. I mean, South Carolina, they know they're going to be in the tournament. Like, what they do from now on out doesn't matter that much. I mean, they might shift seeding a bit, but that's about it. Texas A&M, I think that right now they're battling to even still get into the tournament because they've now lost 4 in a row. But you can kind of excuse a bunch of the losses because the Vandy one, 3 of those 4 were on the road. The Vandy one was on the road, and even though Vandy sucks, that was the game I played Vandy. Because Texas A&M was off a big win over Tennessee, so it was a letdown spot, and it was a sandwich with Alabama coming up after the Vandy game, and they dropped the Vandy game on that kind of ridiculous like put back right at the buzzer at the end for Vandy. So can excuse that maybe as Texas A&M being in a bad spot. Then they lost at Alabama. I can't really blame them for that. Alabama's just a really good team. Then the game against Arkansas, coming back home, they lost by 7. But I think that was another just kind of sandwich spot, even though they didn't play well against Arkansas. I mean, excuse me, against Alabama. They didn't play well against Arkansas either. But they were coming off that Alabama game, and they had Tennessee up on the horizon and this game up after that. So maybe they just didn't take Arkansas totally seriously, even though they had lost to Arkansas by 1 on the road already. So they actually lost twice to Arkansas, so that doesn't look good. Now, coming off their most recent game, they got absolutely annihilated by Tennessee. Tennessee got revenge against them for double-digit outcome in the first game against them, where Texas A&M beat them in Texas A&M by 16 points. Tennessee just absolutely just destroyed them in the most recent game by 35 at Tennessee. Tennessee absolutely wrecked them. So now I think Texas A&M is in the much better bounce back spot here, in the more motivated spot, because they are I'm talking so much about this game and talking it up so much, even though this one is not making my card just because I don't think the number is where I want it to be. But I still like the Texas A&M side only in this one because I think after that annihilation at the hands of Tennessee and being on a 4-game losing streak now and now falling into kind of like the tournament bubble and needing a win. And this is their last ranked team that they're facing in their second to last home game. Texas A&M is going to have to show up here, man. And it's the only time they're facing South Carolina this year, I think, whereas South Carolina has this game surrounded by games that mean more to them, I think. So Texas A&M situationally is the side to play in this one. I just really can't bring myself to lay the 4.5 or whatever it is right now. So I won't be on that one. The 2 games I'm actually going to be on, I'm going way off book here a little bit, or out of the off the beaten path at least, where I think the biggest letdown spot on the board is in the Patriot League, and that's to go against American, and they're up from -1 to -2 with juice, 2.5. I think you can find out there. The number is varying a little bit, but I think you can find Army at +2.5 right now without much difficulty as the home underdog. I like a lot of things about this, but this is the first game on the board. This is actually an earlier game at 4 p.m. Eastern, so it's going to be an earlier slate game. Americans coming off their win of the year, man. They went into Colgate, who was the dominant team in the Patriot Conference, and American took over in the second half and somehow were able to come out of that game with a win. They shot pretty well from a 3-point percentage in that game. The game was pretty close overall statistically, and it was a 12.5-point upset for American, pulling off a huge win over the dominant team in the conference, the 1 seed in the conference. I think Colgate has already completely clinched the 1 seed and then some, because these teams only have a couple games left. So I think you can kind of write that game off for Colgate, even though it was a game at home for Colgate. I think the previous win was a big win for Colgate because they'd beaten Lafayette, who was prior to that the only team in the conference who had beaten Colgate this year in conference play. And they'd beaten them in Colgate. So that was a big win for Colgate. It was a game where I laid the points with Colgate, and they didn't get there as far as the spread is concerned, unfortunately, but they still won. So that was still a big win for Colgate to get that revenge on Lafayette, who was the only team that had beaten them in the Patriot League. And then I think not only was that the big revenge win, but I think that also clinched the 1 seed. It clinched the regular season Patriot title, I believe, for Colgate. So I'm pretty sure they're already locked into the 1 seed for the Patriot tournament, which also means they're hosting the tournament. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. I mean, Colgate is easily the best team in this conference, and that's been, it seems like it's been that way for years at this point, where it's just Colgate and then everybody else. But that puts a big target on their back, and it meant they were not in the best spot against American there, and they'd already beaten American at American by 19 points. So American really showed up, uglied up the game. The game was really a slow-paced game. American does like to play really slow, but now American's coming off that huge win of the year. Big win on the road at Colgate. Now they have a second straight road game going to Army, a team they already beat by 19 points, another 19-point outcome at home earlier this year in a game that's kind of shockingly high scoring for an American Army game, because not only does Ken Baum have these teams both rated really low, but he has them both in the bottom 10 in tempo in the entire country. So it's expected that an American Army game, they're both in the 350s tempo-wise. I think it's expected that it's going to be just an ugly, really slow-paced game, so meaning that the points are even worth more. So you're getting points at home with Army in this one, but not only are you getting points, and is the pace probably going to be slow, which is a good situation to take a home underdog where the points are worth more, but everything else about the situation points to Army as well. As I'm saying, American, huge letdown spot for them here, and second straight road game. They already beat Army, so they might overlook Army. And the final game that they have up after this is a game against Navy, who at least is slightly ahead of Army in the standings, but it also is the final home game for American, even though they also did beat Navy already this year. That's still probably going to be a big game because it's the final home game of the season. It's like senior night. You don't know how well you're going to do in the Patriot tournament, although I think the entire conference still gets into the Patriot tournament, but you might argue, well, but Americans like battling for seeding here, right? Because they're kind of like, if they drop this game, they could fall behind Lehigh or whatever and drop from a 3 to a 4. I don't think anybody really cares about that. I mean, I think as long as you remain in the top 4, I think it means you're going to host one game in the tournament. I think that's how it works in the American. The higher seed hosts the games until it gets to the final or whatever. Well, when it gets to the final, I think the final team still does host it because I think Colgate's going to be hosting it. Or maybe Colgate hosts the whole tournament. I don't know. I don't know how the Patriot one works. But so if Colgate hosts the whole thing, then the seeding means even less. But even so, I don't think the seeding between like a 3 and 4 seed really is going to matter that much to American. That win against Colgate, that like made their season, man. Like, because I think they know they're probably not going to win the Patriot tournament, even though they're going to show up for it probably and try to win it and play well. But beating Colgate, that's a huge win. That makes your season. They're in a letdown spot. Like I said, second straight road game against an Army team they already beat, who plays ridiculously ugly basketball, and they have their senior night coming up in the final game after this against Navy. So I think they could easily overlook Army in this spot. Army's lost 2 games in a row, and they're coming off a game against Bucknell that was maybe their most hideous game of the entire season, where they only scored 41 points. I think that's their lowest point total of the season. Really, really horrific point total. And the last game they had, or actually, yeah, that is their lowest point total. I think their other previous low was a really horrendous game against an awful team in Stonehill, in my neck of the woods, Stonehill, where they actually somehow lost to Stonehill. Or I think Stonehill only has 3 wins on the season, and somehow Army lost at Stonehill and lost by 13 and only scored 34 points in that game. So besides their prior game here against Bucknell, that was their lowest point total. And what did they do after that? They had a second straight road game. Maybe the Stonehill game is a look ahead because they had a second straight game, which I think was it a true road game? It was. They had a second straight road game. They went into Indiana as 25.5-point underdogs coming off that really ugly game, and they kind of mucked up the Indiana game a little bit. That was a game where Army was tied with Indiana. That kind of shows you that Indiana's not as good as we thought they were. So probably shouldn't have been a 25.5-point favorite. But Army was tied with them with like 3.5 minutes to go in the game and wound up losing by 8. But that also tells you that Army, after that really horrendous performance where they only scored 44 against Stonehill, they bounced back and they played a really good game in the next game. I don't even know how the game was as close as it was. Indiana shot 58.1% from the floor in that game to Army's 39.3%, and still Indiana almost lost the game. So I don't even know how that could possibly be the case. Army had 61 field goal attempts to Indiana's 43. So they only had one fewer field goal making the game. And Indiana also had 22 free throw attempts to Army's 9 in that game. And I'm going off on tangents here, but I just find this to be crazy. I haven't looked at box scores like this. Indiana had 18 free throw makes, and Army only had 3 in the game, and Army still almost didn't lose that game. That's just crazy. But I'm just mentioning it because Army, that shows you that Army, after that other really horrific game they played with a really horrible point total, losing to one of the worst teams in college basketball, they bounced back and played a really good game in the next game. So I think they're in a similar bounce back type of spot here, coming back home. And this is senior night for them as well. This is their final home game, and it's against an American team that just beat Colgate, the class of the conference, and already beat Army on the road here. So I expect Army to show up in this game for their final home game of the season. For American, maybe not so much because they have their final home game coming up next, and they're coming off such a monster win over Colgate. So I like Army in this one, as ugly as it seems. We're going to the Patriot League here and taking Army plus the 2.5. And then the other game I'm on is I've been right on all these. I had been right on a lot of these Kentucky games up until last night, so I'd had a good gauge on Kentucky's recent games and getting a lot of those right, betting wise or just lean wise, and until last night when I finally lost that one. But the same could be said for some of these Big East games. Like the games that Creighton was getting involved in, but this is not going to be Creighton's game. This is going to be St. John's off of the blowout win over Creighton, because that's what they're off of. So I think St. John's is in a letdown spot now. They just blew out Creighton, a huge game. That was Johnny Day or whatever. It was, I think, their final Madison Square Garden game. So that was a big game where the crowd showed up, and it was a big game against a big opponent in Creighton. And, of course, Creighton was in a monster letdown. This was on Sunday, I believe. Creighton had just beaten UConn. I mean, that was like the win of the season for Creighton. So they were in a horrible letdown spot. St. John's was in a good spot, I thought. So I played that one, and St. John's showed up. And now St. John's, it's their turn to be in the letdown spot. And, of course, you can explain that win, the fact that it was Johnny Day, huge step-up game for St. John's, and a bad letdown spot for Creighton. Now St. John's, they're coming off. They're having to go on the road, and this is going to be the letdown spot for them. And they already beat Butler at home, which is who they're playing today, by 16 points. They beat them at home. So playing a team you already beat by double digits and coming off one of your wins of the season, basically, probably your win of the season. I think that was their biggest win of the season. Yeah, because looking at their other big games, St. John's played at UConn really close but lost. They had played Creighton really close at Creighton and lost. So at UConn and at Creighton, they played really close games but lost. They played a close game at home against Marquette and lost, and also lost on the road to Marquette by 11 or whatever. So that was St. John's big win of the season against Creighton, and it puts them at least kind of back on the tournament bubble, although I still think at this point St. John's may not get in, but they're also facing a Butler team that's also on the bubble and fighting to get in. So both of these teams have motivation as far as that's concerned, as far as trying to get into the tournament. But I think the motivation is much more strong on the Butler side here, with St. John's coming off that monumental win. I just don't know what they're going to have left. And they already beat this Butler team by double digits. So Butler's going to be the team that has the adjustments to make. And St. John's might get a little bit complacent coming into this game, be feeling a bit high on themselves after a monster win over Creighton, and winning easily too by double digits. Whereas Butler, they were on a good stretch, but since then they've lost 4 in a row. But they lost to Marquette and Creighton. You can't really blame them for losing those. And of course, people might look at this and say, even though Butler did beat Creighton on the road earlier in the season, their most recent matchup against Creighton, they lost badly at home by 20, whatever. And people might look at that and say, well, wait a minute, St. John's just blew out Creighton, and Creighton just beat Butler very easily. Well, blowout, I guess. Both double-digit games in those 2 games. St. John's just beat Creighton by double digits, and Creighton just beat Butler by double digits in the recent matchups. So this is easy. Of course, they're going to take St. John's here, right? And they're the team that has the better conference record, tied an overall record. It's a game where it's like basically a pick the winner line. This is so easy. Actually, you're getting a point or two with St. John's here. Possibly can take them as an underdog on the money line or whatever. That's what the public is going to think, is what I'm saying. Let's take St. John's here is what they're going to think. It looks so easy to take St. John's. Butler's just been ass in their last 4 games, but obviously I look at it completely differently, with St. John's being in the letdown spot and playing a team that they've already beaten easily. Butler, they're going to have to bounce back, man, because they lost, like I said, they lost to Marquette and Creighton in those first 2 of those 4 losses. That's excusable. And then they lost on the road to Villanova and Seton Hall. I mean, those aren't easy places to play either. And they'd already beaten Villanova, although they actually wound up getting season swept by Seton Hall. So Seton Hall has kind of put themselves back on the tournament radar there for sure. Like, it looks like Seton Hall is kind of likely to get in at this point, whereas the same maybe cannot be said for Butler or St. John's right now. But Butler's going to be in a bounce back spot, man. That's out of those 4 losses, that's kind of the least excusable. The loss at Seton Hall in kind of a revenge spot for Seton Hall, having beaten them in Butler earlier this year. So that was kind of the least excusable one. And now I think Butler is going to be the team that's going to have to turn it back on for this game. I think they're going to show up. They're in a bounce back spot. They're going to be motivated, whereas St. John's is just off such a huge win. They cannot possibly be in a very good spot here. Butler has gone up from an opener of a pick 'em up to 1.5, I think, or through the 1 to 1.5. I think 1.5 probably doesn't matter that much between the two. It looks like you can find 1.5 with reduced juice out there right now. Might be the best that you can do, or you could play Butler on the money line potentially if you wanted to. I see that you can actually lay on only 114 on the money line. So if you want to do that, that might not be a bad way to look either on that one. So that's the way that I look there. And then let's see what else we got here. And then going to NBA quickly here before I leave for the day. All my videos just start becoming long. This isn't going to be as long as the other 2 though, at least, because I do only have 3 plays here. This game has actually dropped since I grabbed it earlier this morning, which isn't good. But the only game I'm actually looking at playing is to be on the Toronto Raptors again here, going back to the well here. This line has dropped from Mavericks 3.5 to 2.5 though, as the road favorite here. So let me look real quick here and see if let's see. You could still get it at 3 out there, it looks like. So maybe you could still be able to take it at 3, but this line's crashing. It was at 3.5 earlier this morning, though. So I apologize for that. But I think 3.5, not that much of a difference, although it's kind of dropping now to 2.5. So I would probably get on this before it drops too far. But I think this is a bad spot for Dallas, man. I mean, they're in a back-to-back, although, of course, that's factored into the line a little bit because Toronto did not play yesterday and Dallas did. But I think people are going to look at this and think it looks so easy to take Dallas here, though, because Dallas is the way better team. They have the way better record over Toronto, and they're going to look and think this has got to be a bounce back spot for Dallas at this point, right? I don't really think so, because they're playing not only a back to back, but a third straight road game and a third game in 4 days on the road, even though they did lose both of those games. Last night's game was a battle against a pretty good Cleveland Cavs team, and Cleveland did shoot 50% from three, so there is that. But Cleveland also had 16 turnovers in the game and still somehow won the game. So they were the much better team on the boards and better at the more predictable shooting as well. So Cleveland was able to get out of there with a win, but Cleveland's a good team, man, and that was a battle for Dallas. I think Dallas was focused on that game. Dallas showed up in that game, man, and Dallas was beating them late in the game. They had the lead by 8 with like 4 minutes left in the game at Cleveland. So Dallas was looking like they were going to win that game, and then they kind of just had it just ripped away from them in the end. And now they have to come off of that big battle against Cleveland, a good Cavs team, and go up to Toronto with no time off. And then up next on Friday, they have Boston. And then they come back home and face Philadelphia. And that Boston game is going to be big. And they lost at home to Boston not very long ago, back on January 22nd by 9. So, I mean, how could you not be like looking ahead to Boston a little bit here? I think Dallas could overlook this Toronto team, man. I mean, they gave it their all in that game against Cleveland last night. They come off games against Phoenix, Indiana, and Cleveland in their last 3, and those are all teams with better records than Toronto. Those are all teams that you kind of get up for, although Dallas didn't play well in the Indiana game either. Indiana smoked them really by 22, so yesterday was kind of the spot where you think Dallas was going to show up and play better, and I do think they did, and they covered because Cleveland was the home favorite. So Dallas was able to get in the number there. Dallas played a good game last night, and now coming off that, no time off, facing Toronto, I don't think it's a good spot for Dallas at all. And you see that the line is dropping on Dallas and Toronto. I mean, of course, you're going to see they did just beat Indiana. So I don't know if people are going to like maybe factor the syllogism into it at all, because Toronto just beat Indiana in their last game, which is a game I was on. I thought it was a bad spot for Indiana coming off that blowout over Dallas. So I don't know if people are going to look at that and say, but wait a minute, Toronto beat Indiana, who destroyed Dallas. So let's take Toronto here. I don't think that's going to be the public sentiment. I mean, you look at this, we see everything that I look for here. Mavericks are public with 97% of the tickets and only 94% of the cash. So they're heavily public. It looks too easy to take the Mavericks. The team with the way better record is a small favorite. The cash discrepancy is on the side of the Raptors, even though the heavier cash percentage and the much heavier ticket percentage are both on the Mavs, meaning they're the public team. They have a little bit less of the cash, but still the majority of the cash, and the line is reverse moving against them. So that's everything I look for, man. Everything I look for in the market indicating on the Toronto side in this one, and I'm explaining why I think that is in the situation. So I don't think the public is looking at the fact that Toronto just won at Indiana, whereas Indiana just smoked Dallas. The public is just saying, like, we think Dallas is going to probably bounce back here from a couple of losses. Dallas is the way better team. The public's not going to be coming in and taking the Toronto Raptors here, but I like the Raptors a lot better. And this is a big game for Toronto. They have Dallas coming into their house, a team with a good record. I don't think Toronto's going to be unfocused here. I mean, they are returning home from a road trip, but it's only a 2-game road trip where they had a couple of days off in the middle of the road trip. So not really a grueling road trip by any means. So I don't think this is really a return home distraction spot. And plus, when it's Dallas, I don't think you're going to really be that distracted. Dallas is a good team. So I like all that for Toronto. I don't think they're going to show up unfocused here. They're in the better rest spot and travel spot here, despite the fact they're returning home from a road trip. I mean, Dallas, yeah, I mean, they're coming off like such a brutal game with no time off, and I'm pretty sure that the way that they lost that game, I think they lost on an insane buzzer beat. I'm watching it right now just to see here. Actually, let me see. I'm watching it right now because I didn't see the game. I didn't see what happened at the end of this game. It looks like Dallas retook the lead with 2 seconds left in the game, and then Max Strus like just threw up like a shot from beyond half court. This says it was a 59-footer and hit it to win the game on a buzzer beater like that. That rips your heart out, man. If you're Dallas, I think this is absolutely going to be a hangover spot for them. Dallas had the win, man. They had the win in their grasp. They had scored to retake the lead with 2 seconds left. Like, it's pretty much guaranteed you're going to win the game unless Strus hits a shot from beyond half court, and that's exactly what he did to win that game. So yeah, no thanks on the Dallas side here. We're going to be on Toronto here. I mean, that's a game that just is such a deflating loss, and with no time off to try to bounce back from that, even though the public sentiment is going to be, we're going to take the Mavs as the better team, they got to bounce back here, right? I don't think so. I'm going to be on the Toronto Raptors again, so that's going to do it for me. Only 3 plays with a pretty big card tonight, but we're being selective here. The plays in college basketball are Army plus 2.5, Butler minus 1.5. I think is where it's at, and all you can do here. And then the Toronto Raptors at plus 3.5, or you might be able to get plus 3 with reduced juice or something like that. Might still be out there, maybe just plus 3, whatever you want to call it, something like that. Toronto plus the points. Hopefully it doesn't get away from you too much there, but that's the only spot that I really like that much in the NBA. So let's have a good one, man. Let's get back on the winning side. Last night should have been a winner, and it wasn't. My handicapping, I think, was pretty good last night, and it's just that just hurts. Let's do it. Have a good one, man. Peace.